Hey everyone, I'm Abhiyan Lahiri. I worked under my mentor Kyle, who has experience as a structural engineering at Blue Origin. I'm presenting from Oak Park, California. Today, I want to share my project that I worked on called a comparison in propulsion and cost of sugar-based versus Estes rocket motors. The goal of this project was to compare the efficiency of two types of rocket motors, as stated in the title. I go on to compare different elements you should consider when picking between rocket motors, or even if you want to pursue going into rocketry at all. In short, I wanted to determine whether making your own rocket motor is actually worth it compared to buying one just off the shelf. So, in my opinion, model rocketry is pretty awesome. I've personally learned aspects of physics, engineering, and chemistry all in one hobby. But at the end of the day, your rocket is only as good as its motor. Most people buy motors from companies like Estes or Aerotech because they're usually super reliable and cheap. But there's also been a growing community of DIY motor builders who make their own propellants at home. These propellers are called sugar motors. While researching this community, I wondered if it's actually worth the time and risk to build one yourself. Was it going to be cheaper? Did it work better? Would it just be smarter to buy one off the shelf? That's what I wanted to figure out in the following project. For my methodology to test my project, I had to actually build my own sugar motor. And the main component of this propeller is potassium nitrate, which is mixed with powdered sugar. If you're unfamiliar with potassium nitrate, it's basically the stuff that you use in stump removers. So if you have a stump in your backyard, you can put in potassium nitrate and it basically degrades the wood, so it's easier to rip off. And of course, everyone's familiar with powdered sugar, I hope. Here's the breakdown of the process of making a rocket motor out of these components. I used a PVC tubing as the casing for the rocket motor, which is what the mixture is actually contained in. Then I used a wooden dowel, which doubled as a measuring tool and something to tighten the mixtures. I packed a clay layer at the bottom of the nozzle base so it actually holds the propellant inside. Then I packed in sugar and a nitrate-based propellant really tightly. This was most of what was in the PVC tubing. And finally, I added another clay layer on top and my motor was almost ready. To finish, I had to drill a nozzle carefully through the bottom layer of the clay into the propellant. I had to go super slow because there was a risk of it combusting because it does combust in excessive heat. It was a bit of a tedious process, but it did end up working out. Next, I needed a way to actually test the thrust. So I made a pretty simple test stand. I mounted the motor upside down on an analog scale, which is secured against a concrete block, and then I lit it. As it fired, the scale measured the force, and I recorded the data every 0.033 seconds. Then I put it into an Excel sheet and I converted it from pounds to newtons and graphed it to get a test thrust curve. It was pretty simple, but it did the job. Here's what I got. My sugar motor reached a peak thrust of around 21 newtons and burned for about 1.6 seconds. That's strong enough for most small and mid-sized rockets. Now, let's compare that to Estes. The D12-5 rocket motor, which I tested, hits around 33 newtons at its peak, which is much higher than mine, so it can lift heavier rockets. However, the other motor that I tested, the C11 engine, peaks at around 20.4 newtons, which is around my sugar motor's performance, but mine burns longer, giving more impulse overall. So in short, the commercial ones generally outperform my DIY version, especially the D12-5. Next, I went into cost analysis. Performance is one thing, but money is also a factor when considering what rocket motor you want. I broke down the cost of each type of motors in this chart. For sugar motors, once you bought the initial supplies, each one comes out to about $2.80 to make. So for example, 10 sugar motors cost me around $28 to make. Now let's compare that to Estes. 10 C11 5 motors cost around $50 to purchase plus the extra shipping. Then D12 5 motors cost $75 to purchase, not including shipping and tax. And the gap only gets bigger as you scale up. If you're buying 20 motors, you're spending about $150 for Estes D12s, but you're only spending $56 if you're making sugar motors, which is about a third of that cost. So in terms of raw dollars, DIY is clearly the cheaper option, the more you make. Some other trade-offs is while questioning if sugar motor is better, It really depends. In terms of safety, Estes motors are way cheaper. They're way safer. They're made in factories, they're sealed, and they're consistent. Making sugar motor means you're working with flammable powders and drilling into propellants, and there are many risks of combustion or even inhaling mildly toxic fumes. In terms of time and convenience, buying an Estes motor takes seconds, while building a sugar motor takes hours. In terms of reliability, SS motors are predictable. My sugar motor worked, but results can vary depending on how well the propellant is mixed or packed. In terms of purpose, if you're competing or need precision, you'd want a commercial motor since they're reliable and consistent. But if your goal is education and learning, the chemistry and physics of building an actual sugar motor teaches you a lot. So let's circle back to the original question. Is making your own sugar motor actually worth it? For my results, I found that while SS motors outperform sugar motors in thrust and consistency, the homemade option was drastically cheaper. More importantly, building them gave me an inside look at propulsion, which is something you can't fully appreciate just by buying a motor in a pack. But I think this matters just beyond my experiment. On a personal scale, this project shows how powerful hands-on engineering can be, building something from raw chemicals and tubing. I learned more about chemistry, safety, and engineering design than I could ever have just by reading a textbook. That's a big deal for students and educators who want real and applied learning applications. On a community scale, sugar motors can actually make rocketry more accessible. The biggest barrier for a lot of hobbyists like students or schools without big budgets is cost. SS motors are fantastic, but they add up quickly, and a classroom with limited funding might only be able to afford a handful of launches. But if that same classroom learned to build sugar motors safely, suddenly they could run dozens of launches for the same prices. This means more experiments, more practice, and more opportunity for learning. On a larger scale, my project highlights the important through that engineering and science about innovation, that innovation doesn't always come from commercial polished products that's conducted in a lab environment with safety goggles and white coats. Sometimes it comes from the DIY spirit, from people who are curious enough to take things apart, experiment, and build from scratch. I like to believe that every one of us have that type of DIY spirit in us. In a way, sugar motors represent that spirit. They're not the most powerful or reliable, but they force you to understand the why behind propulsion. And that curiosity-driven innovation is what pushes aerospace forward. Now, I'm not saying sugar motors should replace commercial ones. They definitely won't because safety is the top concern and nothing beats the reliability of a factory-made motor. But I think the larger implication of my study is that both approaches have their place. SS motors help us fly safely and consistently, while sugar motors help us learn and innovate while keeping costs down. If more students and schools and hobbyists can recognize that balance between rocketry, and then they can grow as a community. More people can get involved, more experiments can be run, and more future engineers can be inspired. So in the end, the study wasn't just about comparing numbers on the thrust curve or calculating dollars per motor. It's about showing that there's more than one viable path to learning and progress. The commercial path gives you flight, and the DIY path gives you an understanding. And both push us forward as a community of learners, makers, and engineers. Thank you, and I'd love to take any questions.
Well done, Abhiyan. Thank you so much for sharing this incredible work. I personally appreciated how you've connected and really got to the bottom of the goal of the goal. Is the goal to learn or is the goal to innovate? I mean, there's so many different pathways that this project has demonstrated. So thank you for highlighting those for us. One of my questions is, you mentioned at home the safety of sugar motors is perhaps unreliable, obviously very different from manufactured devices. Now, how might an informed student replicate this experiment at home? And in what ways can one keep that safety and security in mind for themselves?
Well, as I went over in the methodology, um, replicating this engineering process isn't a very difficult process, but it is quite dangerous just because you need to have specific knowledge about how to store your materials and everything. For example, potassium nitrate has to be stored in a cool and dry environment. It shouldn't be anywhere, it shouldn't be around any liquids. And actually, while packing, I had to hammer down the propellants which can also be dangerous because it releases a lot of kinetic energy, which can transform into heat. And heat can actually combust this engineering, so it's required that you do it in a cooler environment. So for this, I think you just need to have a knowledge of you don't want to like overforce your engineering. You want to be gentle while making everything, and you always want to leave a mask on just so you avoid inhaling anything dangerous. And you do not want to use any mechanical tools such as blades or actual drills. So because they do tend to go super fast, and doing it by hand is a lot more gentler.
Excellent tips. Thank you. Now, Abhiyan, was this a project that you did at school or at home? How did you secure your own lab space, as it were?
This was something I did at home. So I did use my garage for this, but I realized that I needed an open environment. So I kept the backyard door open, and I don't have any direct neighbors, so I wasn't really concerned about polluting like anyone's space. But it was important for me to keep an open environment, and it's generally not safe to do so in a lab.
Very thoughtful. Thank you so much for connecting those dots. And I appreciate, like I started by saying, the way that you've outlined the different goals rocketry can achieve, the safety, the security, the reliability, the accessibility. I think that you've highlighted a lot of important topics for us to think about. So thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.